The day I swore to fight the world wasn't the day I became its most feared man. It was the day I almost lost the only person who ever looked at me without fear. The first light of dawn slipped through the rows of old oak trees as I stood alone in the cemetery, my hands buried inside the pockets of a charcoal overcoat that suddenly felt heavier than everything I had carried for the last 34 years. The city behind me was waking up. Delivery trucks rolled through empty streets. Coffee shops unlocked their doors. Joggers chased another ordinary morning. None of them knew that only a few miles away, the man they whispered about in expensive restaurants and quiet boardrooms was standing in front of a simple white stone, wishing power had ever meant something more than silence. My name is Adrian Romano, and for most of my life people believed I could have anything I wanted. They were wrong. Money bought loyalty. Influence bought obedience. Fear bought distance. None of those things ever bought peace. The fresh lilies resting beneath the stone carried tiny drops of dew that reflected the sunrise like scattered diamonds. Claire always loved lilies. She once laughed because I couldn't tell the difference between flowers, claiming every bouquet looked exactly the same to me. She wasn't wrong. Back then, I could recognize the sound of a luxury engine from 3 blocks away, remember every face that walked into one of my buildings, and negotiate deals worth millions without reading a single page twice. But flowers? They had never mattered until she smiled while holding them. Funny how love rearranges a man's priorities without asking permission. A cool breeze drifted across the hill, carrying the scent of wet grass and spring rain left behind during the night. I closed my eyes for only a second, and somehow I could still hear her voice. Calm. Gentle. Stubborn enough to challenge me even when everyone else lowered their heads. She never cared about my reputation. She cared about whether I had eaten breakfast, whether I had slept, whether I remembered that ordinary people smiled at strangers for no reason at all. She treated me like a man before she ever saw the monster the newspapers invented. Maybe that was why losing her felt like losing the last honest reflection of myself. I rested one hand against the cold marble and finally spoke the words I had carried in silence for months. I failed you once. I won't fail you again. The promise disappeared into the quiet morning, unnoticed by everyone except the wind. Somewhere across the city, people were already making plans that would force impossible choices onto both of us before another sunrise arrived. They believed they understood loyalty. They believed they understood sacrifice. They had no idea that every empire, no matter how untouchable it seemed, eventually met one promise strong enough to bring it to its knees. And mine had already been made. 8 months earlier, I believed every morning would look exactly like the one before it. My penthouse overlooked Manhattan from nearly 60 floors above the streets, where the city resembled a carefully arranged model instead of the restless place it truly was. Sunrise painted the glass towers gold while I stood with a cup of untouched black coffee cooling in my hand. My assistant reviewed the day's schedule with flawless precision. Meetings. Contracts. Charity board approvals. Real estate negotiations. Every hour already belonged to someone else before I even stepped into the elevator. That was how my life worked. Every decision measured. Every conversation calculated. Every smile carrying a purpose. The newspapers called me a billionaire investor. Business magazines praised my discipline. They never asked why every room I entered felt colder after I arrived. They never noticed that success could become another kind of prison. By 8:30, my driver eased the black sedan into midtown traffic. The streets buzzed with commuters balancing paper coffee cups, cyclists weaving between taxis, and parents hurrying children toward school before the crosswalk signal disappeared. I watched them through the tinted window with quiet curiosity. They laughed without checking who might overhear. They argued over breakfast. They looked wonderfully ordinary. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten what ordinary even felt like. We stopped at a red light near a neighborhood park where cherry blossoms had begun to bloom. The breeze carried pink petals across the sidewalk like drifting snow. That was when I noticed her for the first time. She knelt beside a frightened golden retriever whose leash had slipped from an elderly man's trembling hand. While everyone else rushed around them, she stayed perfectly calm. She spoke softly, holding one hand low until the nervous dog slowly walked toward her. The old man smiled with visible relief as she returned the leash and brushed dirt from her jeans as though helping strangers was the most natural thing in the world. She accepted his grateful hug with the same quiet smile before continuing toward the small brick elementary school across the street, a canvas bag hanging from one shoulder and a stack of colorful art projects balanced carefully against her chest. I found myself watching long after the traffic light turned green. My driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, sir?" I looked away from the sidewalk and answered automatically. "Yes." "Keep driving." But my eyes searched for her reflection until the school disappeared behind another row of buildings. I did not know her name. I did not know she taught art to children who adored her because she remembered every birthday and every dream they whispered while mixing paint. I did not know that she volunteered at a community center every Saturday or that she always carried granola bars inside her bag because someone nearby might be hungry. All I knew was that for the first time in years, someone had interrupted the perfect order of my morning without saying a single word to me. I should have forgotten the moment before lunchtime. Instead, it followed me into every meeting, every signature, every carefully rehearsed conversation, lingering quietly in the back of my mind like a melody I could not explain. At the time, I thought it was only curiosity. I had no idea that a single ordinary morning had already begun changing the course of both our lives forever. The following Thursday, the rain arrived without warning, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the glowing skyline above. My last meeting ended later than expected, and instead of returning directly to the office, I asked my driver to take the long route through the Upper West Side. I told myself I wanted a few extra minutes to think before another endless evening of negotiations, but the truth was harder to admit. I hoped I might see the woman from the park again. The idea sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. I did not know her name. She had no reason to remember a man sitting behind dark-tinted glass. Yet something about her quiet kindness had stayed with me in ways I could not explain. We stopped near a crosswalk as children poured out of the elementary school wearing colorful raincoats and oversized backpacks. Parents waved from parked cars while teachers stood beneath umbrellas making sure every child reached the correct adult. Then I saw her. Claire stood on the front steps laughing with one of her students, helping a little girl tie the ribbon around a painting that had begun to come loose in the rain. She crouched without hesitation, carefully fixing the ribbon before handing the artwork back with both hands as though it belonged in a museum instead of a second-grade classroom. The little girl threw her arms around Claire's shoulders before running toward her mother with the biggest smile I had seen all week. My driver noticed where I was looking. "Someone you know, sir?" "No," I answered quietly. "Not yet." Before I realized what I was doing, I stepped out of the car. My security team exchanged uncertain glances but remained several yards behind me, allowing me the rare illusion of walking alone. The rain had become lighter, leaving only a cool mist drifting through the air. Claire adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder and started toward the subway entrance while balancing a stack of student projects against her chest. Halfway across the sidewalk, a sudden gust scattered several colorful drawings into the street. Papers fluttered like bright birds between parked cars, and without thinking, I moved to catch the nearest one before it disappeared beneath a passing delivery truck. Another sheet landed against my shoe. Then another. For the next few seconds, the powerful businessman everyone feared became nothing more than another stranger chasing watercolor paintings through the rain. Claire hurried toward me, slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed from embarrassment. "I am so sorry," she said, kneeling to gather the remaining papers. "My students would never forgive me if I lost these." I handed her the drawings, careful not to wrinkle the edges. "Looks like they are safe." She smiled, and the city around us seemed strangely quieter. "Thanks to you." Her eyes were a soft blue, clear enough to make every rehearsed sentence disappear from my mind. She glanced at the black sedan waiting nearby but said nothing about it. She simply extended her hand with the same effortless sincerity she had shown the frightened dog in the park. "I am Claire Bennett." I accepted her hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "Adrian Romano." There was no flicker of recognition. No hesitation. No curiosity about headlines or wealth or reputation. To her, I was only the man who had rescued a handful of children's paintings from the rain. She thanked me once more before disappearing down the subway stairs, leaving behind nothing except the faint scent of rain, fresh paint, and the unfamiliar feeling that for the first time in years, I wanted tomorrow to arrive sooner than today. Over the next several weeks, New York became smaller than I had ever imagined. Out of all the millions of people moving through its streets every day, I kept finding Claire in the most ordinary places. One Saturday morning, she was carrying bags of groceries for an elderly neighbor whose hands shook too much to manage the stairs alone. On Tuesday evening, I passed a community center where children crowded around a folding table covered in paint, and there she was again, laughing because one little boy had somehow managed to get blue fingerprints on his own forehead. She never seemed to notice how often our paths crossed. Or perhaps she simply believed coincidence was kinder than suspicion. I had spent years studying people because my world demanded it. I could usually predict what someone wanted within the first minute of a conversation. Claire was different. She never asked for favors. She never tried to impress anyone. She never changed who she was depending on who stood in front of her. That alone made her extraordinary. One afternoon, I walked into a neighborhood coffee shop I had never visited before. The place smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls and dark roast coffee instead of polished marble and expensive cologne. I almost turned around, thinking I would look completely out of place, until I heard a familiar voice. "Adrian?" She stood near the counter holding 2 paper cups, surprise brightening her face before that same warm smile appeared again. "You keep showing up in unexpected places." I laughed quietly, a sound so unfamiliar that even I barely recognized it. "Maybe the city is smaller than we think." She tilted her head with playful doubt. "Or maybe you finally discovered good coffee." She handed one of the cups toward me before realizing what she had done. "I am sorry. I bought this for another teacher." "Habit." I smiled and shook my head. It is the thought that counts. We ended up sitting near the front window while rain tapped softly against the glass. She talked about her students, about how one little girl believed every cloud deserved a name and how another insisted that dinosaurs would return if enough people believed in them. She spoke with such genuine affection that I found myself listening far more than speaking. When she finally asked about my work, I answered carefully. "Real estate. Investments. Long meetings that should probably be shorter." She laughed. "That sounds exhausting." "It usually is." She stirred her coffee before looking directly into my eyes. "You know, every time I have seen you, you look like someone carrying the weight of an entire building on your shoulders. No one had ever described me that way before. Most people saw confidence. Others saw authority. She somehow noticed exhaustion hiding beneath both. I searched for an answer but found only honesty. Maybe I have been carrying things for so long that I forgot what it feels like to put them down." She nodded without asking another question, respecting a silence that did not need to be filled. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, filling the little coffee shop with a quiet golden glow. For the first time in years, I stayed exactly where I was instead of checking my watch. Somewhere across the city, meetings could wait. Phones could ring unanswered. Deadlines could move. Sitting across from Claire, listening to her describe a world built on kindness instead of control, I realized there were still places where people measured success by the number of lives they brightened rather than the number of buildings they owned. I had spent my entire life mastering one world. Without realizing it, I had already begun wishing I belonged in hers. The first time Claire invited me somewhere, it was not to a charity gala, an exclusive restaurant, or a private rooftop overlooking the skyline. She invited me to the annual spring art fair her students organized inside the elementary school gymnasium. I almost declined. My calendar was filled with meetings that people insisted could not be postponed, and my security director spent 10 full minutes explaining why a crowded public school was not an ideal place for someone in my position. For reasons I could not fully explain, I canceled every appointment before noon. When I walked through the school's front entrance carrying nothing more expensive than a simple bouquet of white lilies, dozens of children's paintings covered every wall with impossible rainbows, smiling suns, and houses drawn in every color except the ones real houses usually were. Claire spotted me from across the room, her expression shifting from surprise to genuine happiness. "You actually came," she said. "You sounded doubtful when you invited me." She laughed softly. "That is because most adults promise children they will show up, then something more important comes along." I looked around the crowded gym before answering. Nothing more important did. She accepted the flowers with careful hands, breathing in their gentle fragrance before placing them beside the welcome table. "They are beautiful." Watching her smile made the entire room seem brighter than the afternoon sunlight pouring through the high windows. For the next hour she introduced me to every student as though I were simply another guest. No titles. No special treatment. One little boy proudly showed me a cardboard spaceship held together with more glue than cardboard. Another insisted I judge whose watercolor turtle looked friendlier. Claire watched the conversations from across the room, quietly amused by how completely out of place I looked while trying my best to answer every impossible question. At one point a little girl with freckles tugged on my jacket sleeve and whispered, "Are you Miss Bennett's boyfriend?" I nearly choked on the lemonade I had been drinking. Before I could respond, Claire walked over carrying a tray of homemade cookies. "Emily," she said with a smile, "we do not ask grown-ups embarrassing questions." The little girl frowned thoughtfully. "Why not? They ask us questions every day." Claire laughed so hard she had to set the tray down before any cookies fell. I found myself laughing with her, the sound coming easier than it ever had before. Later that afternoon, after families began leaving, we carried folded tables back into storage together. The gym had grown quiet except for the squeak of rolling carts and the distant echo of children playing outside. Claire brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear and looked at me with gentle curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you are with the children, you seem completely different." I paused before answering. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said. "Like you forget you are supposed to carry the whole world." Her words settled somewhere deep inside me because they were true. Around her, I stopped measuring every sentence before speaking. I stopped wondering what people expected from me. I simply existed, and somehow that felt unfamiliar and comforting at the same time. As we stepped outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the playground. Claire looked toward the children laughing beneath the swings before quietly saying, "Everyone deserves at least one place where they do not have to pretend." I followed her gaze, realizing that without noticing when it happened, she had already become that place for me. The illusion that I could keep my two worlds separate ended on an ordinary Monday morning. I arrived at the office before 7, expecting another predictable day of contracts and conference calls, but the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom felt unusually heavy. My oldest advisor, Vincent Moretti, stood silently beside the floor-to-ceiling windows with a folder in his hands. He had known my family longer than I had been alive, and the lines across his face deepened whenever something threatened the careful balance we had maintained for years. He slid the folder across the polished table without saying a word. Inside were photographs. Claire leaving the elementary school. Claire carrying groceries. Claire laughing outside the neighborhood coffee shop. Claire walking beside me after the art fair. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That was always how I reacted when something truly mattered. "Who has been watching her?" I asked quietly. Vincent folded his hands. "Not just us." The room became painfully still. "There are people asking questions. They noticed the changes in your schedule. They noticed that you have been declining invitations you never used to refuse. They noticed that you smile now." I looked down at the photographs again. None of them showed anything extraordinary. Just two people sharing ordinary moments. Somehow those ordinary moments had become the most dangerous thing in my life. She does not know anything, I said. Exactly, Vincent replied. And it needs to stay that way. I closed the folder and stared across the skyline stretching beyond the glass walls. For years I had accepted that every decision carried consequences. I simply had never imagined those consequences reaching someone who had done nothing except be kind to me. That evening I canceled dinner with Claire for the first time. I blamed an unexpected business emergency, and she answered with the same understanding she showed everyone else. Work comes first sometimes, she said over the phone. We will find another day. Her voice carried no disappointment, only warmth, and somehow that made the lie feel even heavier. The days that followed became strangely quiet. I still found reasons to drive past her school, but I no longer stopped. I watched from a distance as she greeted parents, encouraged children, and waved goodbye at the end of every afternoon. Once she caught sight of my car waiting across the street. She smiled and waved before I could drive away. I returned the wave through the windshield but never stepped outside. I told myself I was protecting her. The truth was that I was afraid of bringing my shadow any closer to her light. A week later, Claire surprised me by appearing outside my office building just after sunset with a paper bag from the coffee shop we both liked. You disappeared, she said gently as I joined her on the sidewalk. I started wondering if you had finally decided my favorite coffee was terrible. I smiled despite myself. It is still terrible. She laughed. Good. I was worried you were becoming too agreeable. We walked slowly through the evening crowd, neither of us speaking for several minutes. Finally she looked up at me with quiet concern. You have that look again. What look? The one that says you are carrying something alone because you think no one else should help. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain why every step closer to me could cost more than she imagined. Instead I simply looked into her clear blue eyes and realized that the walls I had spent a lifetime building were beginning to crack from the kindness of one ordinary woman who had no idea she was already changing the man standing beside her. The change came so quietly that Claire almost laughed when she first noticed it. Parents who usually lingered outside the school hurried away after picking up their children. A dark SUV seemed to appear on different streets throughout the week, never close enough to feel threatening, yet never far enough to ignore. The community center where she volunteered suddenly received anonymous donations large enough to replace broken art supplies, repair the leaking roof, and purchase new computers for every classroom. She stood in the empty hallway one evening staring at the unopened boxes, wondering who would give so much while asking for nothing in return. My name never appeared on a single document, but she looked at me anyway when we met for coffee that Friday afternoon. Tell me something honestly, she said as she wrapped both hands around a warm ceramic mug. Do you always solve problems before anyone asks you to? I smiled carefully. Does that bother you? She thought for a moment before answering. Not if people choose the help. But sometimes kindness can become another way of making decisions for someone else. Her words settled deeper than she realized. In my world, protecting people meant acting first and explaining later. In hers, respect meant allowing people to stand on their own feet whenever possible. Neither of us was trying to be wrong. We had simply learned survival in different languages. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated across the table. One glance at the screen erased the calm expression from my face. Vincent had sent only 3 words. We need you. I silenced the phone immediately, but Claire had already noticed the change in my eyes. Everything okay? She asked gently. Just work, I replied. She studied me for several seconds. You always say that like work is a storm you have to stand inside by yourself. I forced a smile. Sometimes it is. She reached across the table and rested her fingertips lightly on the back of my hand for only a brief moment before pulling away. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, yet it carried more comfort than every congratulatory handshake I had received in my entire career. Whatever it is, she said softly, I hope you remember that carrying everything alone does not make you stronger. It only makes you tired. I left the coffee shop with those words echoing in my mind. 20 minutes later I entered a private conference room where the atmosphere felt nothing like the warmth I had just left behind. Maps covered the walls. Quiet voices stopped the moment I arrived. Vincent closed the door behind me and slid another folder across the table. This time there were no photographs, only reports. Questions were spreading. Competitors wanted to understand why I had become unpredictable. Charitable investments that once seemed routine were now being examined for hidden motives. Every unexpected decision I had made during the past 2 months had quietly pointed toward the same person without ever mentioning her name. I looked down at the papers, then out the window where the evening sun was disappearing behind the skyline. Somewhere across the city, Claire was probably cleaning paintbrushes after another long day with her students, completely unaware that ordinary happiness had begun attracting extraordinary attention. In that moment I understood something I had refused to admit before. The closer she came to my heart, the closer unseen eyes would eventually come to her life. And for the first time since I met her, I wondered whether the greatest act of love might be walking away before my world reached hers. The message arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon while I was helping my students hang paper lanterns across the community center for our spring family festival. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I smiled, already expecting another photograph from Adrian of a sunrise he claimed looked almost as beautiful as the paintings my students created. Instead, I found a single text that seemed strangely formal. Claire, I need to focus on responsibilities that cannot wait. I think it would be better if we stopped seeing each other. I am sorry. I read the words 3 times before they made sense. They did not sound like the man who stayed after school to help children carry art supplies or laughed because he could never remember the names of different flowers. They sounded like someone hiding behind a carefully constructed wall. My first instinct was to call him. The call went directly to voicemail. I left no message. If he truly wanted distance, I refused to chase someone who had already decided to walk away. The festival continued around me as parents admired paintings and children ran beneath colorful decorations, but every smile suddenly required effort. One of my students slipped a tiny folded drawing into my hand before leaving with his family. It showed 2 stick figures standing beneath a bright blue sky with the words, "Friends always come back, Miss Bennett." I smiled through unexpected tears and tucked the picture safely inside my bag. Across the city, I stood alone in my office long after sunset, staring at my silent phone. I had listened to her voicemail greeting more times than I cared to admit without leaving a single word. Every instinct urged me to drive to her apartment, explain everything, and tell her that every painful sentence I had written had been meant to keep her safe rather than push her away. Instead, I locked the phone inside my desk drawer because I knew that hearing her voice again would destroy the resolve I had forced upon myself. The days that followed became painfully predictable. I buried myself in meetings that lasted hours longer than necessary. Every report, every contract, every conversation blurred together until I could no longer remember what anyone had actually said. At night, I found myself driving past the elementary school after everyone had gone home. The playground stood empty beneath the streetlights, its swings moving gently whenever the wind drifted through the trees. I never stopped the car. I simply watched for a few quiet minutes before disappearing into the traffic again. Claire tried to return to her normal routines, but ordinary life had changed in ways even she could not explain. The coffee shop suddenly felt too quiet. The walk through the park seemed longer than before. Every time a black sedan passed nearby, her heart lifted for one hopeful second before sinking again. She told herself she deserved an explanation. She also told herself that dignity sometimes meant accepting silence even when it hurt. One rainy evening she opened the sketchbook she had been filling throughout the school year. Most pages overflowed with colorful classrooms, smiling children, and blooming gardens. The final blank page remained untouched. After several minutes, she picked up a pencil and began drawing a skyline disappearing into the mist. A single figure stood on one rooftop while another watched from far below, close enough to see but too far away to reach. She closed the sketchbook before finishing the drawing because some stories felt too painful to complete. At that exact moment, only a few miles away, I stood beside the window of my penthouse watching the same rain wash across Manhattan. I whispered her name into the empty room, knowing she would never hear it, and wondered whether protecting the person I loved had quietly become the loneliest decision I had ever made. 3 weeks passed without a single conversation, but silence has a way of carrying its own messages. Every morning I still received anonymous updates confirming that Claire arrived safely at school, that she returned home each evening, and that nothing unusual had happened. I told myself those reports were only precaution, yet I memorized every line before locking them away. It was the only connection I allowed myself to keep. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, one sentence changed everything. Unfamiliar individuals observed Claire Bennett leaving the community center. No direct contact. Continued monitoring recommended. I read the report twice before looking up at Vincent. How long? He hesitated. Several days. Why was I not told immediately? Because nothing happened. I stood so quickly that my chair rolled backward across the hardwood floor. The fact that strangers are watching her means something already happened. Vincent remained calm, but his eyes reflected the same concern I felt. Adrian, this is exactly what we hoped to avoid. If you go to her now, everyone watching will know she matters. I stared through the glass wall toward the skyline where storm clouds gathered above Manhattan. Every decision I had made during the past month had been built on one belief. Distance would protect her. Now I was no longer certain that belief had ever been true. Across the city, Claire locked the art room after finishing preparations for the school's summer exhibition. The hallways echoed with the familiar sounds of custodians stacking chairs and teachers saying goodbye before vacation officially began. She stepped outside carrying a cardboard box filled with paintbrushes the school no longer needed because she planned to donate them to the community center. Halfway down the block, she noticed the same dark SUV parked across the street for the third time that week. It never moved closer. It never followed too closely. It simply remained there like a question without an answer. She tried convincing herself that New York was full of identical vehicles, but something deep inside refused to believe another coincidence. Instead of taking the subway, she walked into the neighborhood library where she often spent quiet evenings reading. Through the second-floor window she could still see the SUV waiting outside. For the first time since Adrian disappeared from her life, uneasiness replaced sadness. Nearly 40 minutes later, another black vehicle stopped beside the curb. This one she recognized immediately. The driver stepped out first, scanning the street before opening the rear door. My heart ignored every warning I had given it. I crossed the sidewalk without thinking, entered the library, and climbed the stairs 2 at a time until I found Claire standing beside a tall window overlooking the street below. She turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, and for one suspended moment neither of us spoke. Surprise gave way to relief, and relief slowly became confusion. Adrian, she whispered. I stopped only a few feet away. There were 1,000 apologies waiting inside me, yet only one sentence mattered. You need to leave with me. Her eyebrows drew together. Why? I looked toward the window where the unfamiliar SUV still waited beneath the fading evening light. Then I looked back into the eyes I had spent weeks trying to forget. Because I was wrong, I said quietly. Walking away did not protect you. It only left you facing something you should never have faced alone. Claire searched my face as though the answer might already be written there. The questions in her eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with disappointment, confusion, and the quiet determination that had always made it impossible for me to hide behind half-truths. You disappeared, she said softly. You decided that for both of us without asking what I wanted. Every word landed exactly where it should. I lowered my eyes for the first time in years because I had no defense worth offering. I believed distance would keep you safe. She folded her arms across her jacket as evening sunlight faded behind the library windows. And did it? I glanced toward the street where the unfamiliar SUV remained parked. No. The single word carried every regret I had buried over the past month. She remained silent, waiting. I finally told her more than I had ever planned to reveal. There are people who pay attention whenever my life changes. They study every decision I make. They noticed you long before I realized they would. I thought if I walked away, they would lose interest. Claire listened without interrupting. Instead, I continued, they kept watching because I had already made the mistake that mattered most. I cared about you. She looked out the window, following my gaze toward the quiet street below. Who are these people? She asked. I took a slow breath. People whose world has nothing to do with yours. That is all you need to know right now. She turned back toward me, and for the first time since we met, I saw hurt stronger than kindness. No, Adrian. That is no longer enough. You cannot ask me to trust you while refusing to trust me. Her words stripped away the final excuse I had been hiding behind. I nodded slowly. You are right. We left the library together as twilight settled over Manhattan. My security team kept a respectful distance while pretending to be ordinary pedestrians. Claire noticed them immediately but chose not to comment. Instead, we walked through the nearby park where the trees swayed gently beneath the evening breeze. It was the same park where I had first watched her calm a frightened dog months earlier. Everything had changed since then except the quiet peace of that place. We stopped beside the small pond where city lights shimmered across the water like scattered stars. I cannot promise you a simple life, I said. I cannot pretend my past does not exist. But I can promise something else. Claire looked at me without speaking. From this moment forward, I will never make another decision about your life without you standing beside me. No more disappearing. No more silence. Whatever comes next, you deserve the truth. She studied me for a long moment before asking the question I had feared most. Does telling me the truth put you in danger? I smiled faintly. It already does. Then why tell me now? I looked toward the skyline where the first lights of night illuminated the city I had spent years trying to control. For the first time, I realized there were things more important than control. Because protecting you without honesty almost cost me the one person who ever made me want to become better than the man I was yesterday. Claire stepped closer, her expression softening as she searched my face one last time. She did not reach for my hand. She did not offer immediate forgiveness. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable. Then do not waste this second chance, Adrian, she whispered. At that moment, as the wind carried fallen leaves across the path between us, I understood that my greatest battle would never be about preserving power. It would be about becoming the kind of man worthy of the trust she had chosen to place in me once again. The truth spread through my world faster than I expected. Once people realized I had chosen honesty over silence, every carefully maintained balance began to shift. Invitations to private meetings arrived one after another. Longtime business partners suddenly wanted reassurance that nothing important had changed. Old family friends asked careful questions wrapped inside polite conversations. They all smiled. None of them believed my answers. They had spent years studying my habits, and they knew I had never rearranged my life for anyone before Claire. Vincent met me before sunrise inside the office overlooking the river. The city below looked peaceful, almost innocent, as ferries crossed the water beneath a pale orange sky. He placed another folder on my desk, but this time I did not open it immediately. Tell me the truth, I said quietly. Not the version you think I want to hear. He sighed. Some people believe your priorities have changed. Others believe that makes you vulnerable. They are watching to see what you choose next. I rested my hands against the cool glass window. Then let them watch. Vincent studied me with an expression that mixed concern and reluctant respect. You understand there is no easy path back after this. I smiled faintly. I stopped looking for easy the day I met Claire. While difficult conversations filled my morning, Claire spent hers preparing the community center for the children's summer art showcase. Bright paintings covered every wall. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling. Music drifted softly through the hallway as volunteers arranged folding chairs for families arriving that evening. She moved from table to table with her usual calm smile, but every so often she caught herself looking toward the entrance without realizing it. Part of her still wondered whether I would keep my promise this time. Shortly before the doors opened, I arrived carrying several large boxes. They were not expensive gifts or elaborate decorations. They were sketchbooks, paint sets, colored pencils, and easels requested by the teachers months earlier but never approved because of budget limits. Claire looked from the supplies to me with quiet surprise. "You remembered." I nodded. "You once told me every child deserves enough paper to draw tomorrow after they finish today." She smiled, shaking her head softly. "I forgot I even said that." I did not. Together we unpacked every box while children gathered outside with their parents. One little boy recognized me from the spring art fair and ran over holding a drawing of the New York skyline. "Look," he said proudly. "I made your building, but I added more trees because Miss Bennett says every city needs room to breathe." I laughed as Claire covered her face, embarrassed by the comment. "He listens better than most adults," she admitted. I studied the colorful picture before crouching beside him. "I think Miss Bennett is right." As the evening continued, I watched Claire encouraging every child with the same patience she had shown from the very beginning. She celebrated tiny victories that most people would never notice. A shy girl proudly explained her watercolor painting to strangers. A nervous boy smiled after hearing applause for the first time. Claire never stood in the center of the room seeking attention. She quietly helped everyone else shine. In that moment I understood what true strength looked like. It was not measured by influence, wealth, or reputation. It was measured by the number of people who walked away believing they mattered because someone had chosen to believe in them first. Looking across the crowded room, I realized that protecting Claire had never been enough. If I truly loved her, then I also had to protect the beautiful ordinary world she had spent years building, because that world had already taught me more about courage than everything I had learned before. Autumn arrived quietly, covering the city in shades of amber and gold that softened even the hardest corners of Manhattan. Life did not suddenly become simple, but it became honest. That alone changed everything. I no longer hid pieces of myself behind carefully chosen words, and Claire no longer accepted silence in place of trust. We learned that truth was rarely comfortable, yet it was always lighter than secrets. One crisp Saturday morning she invited me to walk through Central Park before the city fully awakened. Children chased squirrels across the winding paths while street musicians filled the cool air with gentle violin melodies. We carried hot coffee instead of hurried conversations. For the first time in years, I had nowhere more important to be. Halfway across Bow Bridge, Claire stopped and looked out across the calm lake where the trees reflected perfectly in the still water. "You have changed," she said. I smiled. "I am trying to." She shook her head softly. "No. You already have. The difference is that now you finally believe you can." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the morning. Later that afternoon, I returned to the office where Vincent waited with several folders requiring my signature. He watched as I quietly separated one stack from another. "These projects will continue," I said, pointing toward investments that supported schools, community centers, and neighborhood programs. Then I pushed another stack aside. "These no longer represent the future I want." Vincent looked at me for a long moment before closing the folders. "Your father spent his life believing influence was measured by how much people feared disappointing him." I nodded. "He was wrong." "And what do you believe now?" I thought about Claire encouraging frightened children to believe in themselves, about families smiling beneath colorful paintings, about ordinary afternoons that had somehow become more valuable than every luxury I had ever owned. "I believe influence should leave people stronger than you found them." Vincent smiled with quiet approval. "That is a legacy worth building." Weeks later, the elementary school held its annual fall assembly. Parents filled the auditorium while students proudly displayed artwork inspired by the theme of hope. Claire stood near the stage helping nervous children straighten handmade costumes before their presentations. She caught my eye from across the room and smiled with the same warmth she had shown the very first day we met. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just quiet confidence. Near the end of the program, the principal thanked several local supporters for expanding the school's art resources. When my name was mentioned, polite applause echoed through the auditorium. I remained seated. The recognition did not belong to me. Every decision that had brought me there began with one teacher who believed kindness could reshape the world one child at a time. After the assembly ended, we walked outside beneath a sky so clear it almost looked painted. Claire slipped her hand into mine without saying a word. The gesture felt wonderfully ordinary. I realized then that redemption is rarely a single dramatic moment. More often it arrives through countless small choices repeated every day until they quietly become the person you were always meant to be. As we crossed the school courtyard together, I understood that I had not saved Claire from my world. She had rescued me from the emptiness of mine, and because of her, the future no longer felt like something to control. It finally felt like something worth sharing. 1 year later, the city looked exactly the same from a distance, yet everything that truly mattered had changed. The skyline still reached toward the clouds, yellow taxis still hurried through crowded avenues, and the first snow of December still settled quietly across rooftops before sunrise. But when I opened my eyes each morning, I no longer measured the day by meetings, contracts, or expectations waiting behind polished office doors. I measured it by the sound of laughter drifting from the kitchen downstairs, by the smell of fresh coffee filling a home that finally felt lived in, and by the quiet certainty that peace had never been something I could purchase. It had always been something I had to choose. Claire stood by the window arranging white lilies into a simple glass vase while soft music played through the house. She caught me watching and smiled the same smile that had first interrupted my carefully ordered life months before. "You are staring again," she teased. "I am making sure this is real," I answered. She laughed softly. "After all this time?" I walked across the room and gently took the vase from her hands before placing it on the table. "Especially after all this time." Later that afternoon we visited the community center where children crowded around long tables covered with paint, paper, and holiday decorations. New classrooms had been added during the past year. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. Every art shelf remained full because no teacher ever had to wonder whether supplies would run out before another semester began. None of the improvements carried my name. That had been Claire's only request. If people remember anyone, she had told me, let them remember the children who discovered they were capable of creating something beautiful. I agreed without hesitation because she had taught me that the greatest gifts rarely needed signatures. As families gathered for the annual winter celebration, one little girl tugged on my sleeve with the complete confidence only children possess. "Mr. Adrian," she whispered, "Miss Bennett says every picture tells a story. What is your favorite story?" I looked across the room where Claire knelt beside a group of students helping them finish a giant paper mural of the city. Sunlight poured through the windows, wrapping the room in a warm golden glow. She looked up, caught my eyes, and smiled without realizing the little girl had just asked the most important question of my life. I smiled back before answering. My favorite story is the one that reminded me people are never defined by the world they inherit. They are defined by the promises they choose to keep. The little girl nodded thoughtfully before running back to finish her painting. Claire walked over a few moments later and slipped her hand into mine. "What did she ask you?" she said. I looked around the room filled with laughter, color, and hope before meeting her eyes. "She asked me about my favorite story." "And what did you tell her?" I squeezed her hand gently, grateful for every ordinary moment that had once seemed impossible. "I told her it is still being written." As evening settled over Manhattan, snowflakes drifted quietly beyond the windows while children carried their artwork home with proud smiles. I realized then that I had once believed power meant standing above the world. Claire had shown me something infinitely greater. Real strength is choosing kindness when fear seems easier, choosing truth when silence feels safer, and choosing love every single day until it quietly transforms not only your future, but the person you become. That was the promise that changed my life, and it was the only one I intended to keep for the rest of it.